Hey everyone, Miss JC here. I'm back. I hope your spring break went well. Right now it's still spring break, but when you listen to this and watch this, it'll be over. Hopefully you had a wonderful week, rested, rejuvenated, ready to get back at learning and finishing the school year. So we are on to our third week of online learning, and our skill this week is finding the midpoint of a line segment or a line. So I'm going to go over a couple notes. Remember, you're going to want to take out a piece of paper to write down these notes so that you can have them in front of you, and then you can work through these problems as you do the practice sheet, just as we've done for the last 2 weeks. So as you can see on this slide, we have a diagram at the top. So we're going to just start with a couple notes. So the midpoint of a line segment is a point that divides the segment into two congruent, which means the same or equal, two congruent segments. So if you have the midpoint of something, it's the middle, right? And so that means each side of that middle point are congruent. They're the same. So if you want to look at this visual up here and just kind of think about what I said, the midpoint or the middle, and that helps you think of it. Hopefully you can see the midpoint of this line AC falls right here where point B is. So let's just keep going. A line, ray, or segment that intersects a segment at its midpoint is said to bisect that segment and is called the segment bisector. So some new vocabulary words, so you want to write these down. So I'll read that again. A line, ray, or segment that intersects or crosses a segment at its midpoint is said to bisect that segment. So if it crosses at its midpoint, then it's called the segment bisector. So in the diagram, not to the left, above, I just made this a little bit bigger, so I put it up above. Point B, like we talked about before, point B is the midpoint of line AC, and that's kind of what we talked about. It's in the middle of this line, AC, so this is called the midpoint. And then if we use our other vocabulary words we just learned, line L, so that's this line right here. We've learned that vocabulary word in the first week. Line L is called the segment bisector of line AC because it crosses at that middle, at that midpoint B. All right, so if we get into some examples, we're going to use this skill and this vocabulary word midpoint to solve some of these problems. So question 8 says, if Q is the midpoint of line PR. So you'll want to read the directions and look at the picture. So if Q, which is right here, is the midpoint or the middle of PR, which is the whole line, it asks you to find the value of X. So you're always going to want to make sure you know what the question is asking for. So in the end, you're going to want to know what X equals. That's what the question wants to know. So remember, midpoint means it's in the middle and both sides are congruent. So that means this side over here, and I'm going to kind of highlight it, to the left will be congruent or equal to this side on the right because Q is in the middle. So what I can do is I can take 7x minus 16, which is the expression that represents that green line, and set it equal to 4x plus 2, which is the expression that represents the red line. Set them equal to each other because we know that the midpoint is Q. You don't have to guess that. That's given information. So the problem tells you Q's in the middle, so that means this has to equal these expressions. So now we're just back to solving kind of what we've been doing for a few weeks now. We want to solve for X, get X by itself, remember. So if you want to kind of draw a line down the middle or however helps you solve these, go ahead and do that. So remember, we want all the variables on one side. I like to move them to the left. So that means I need to move this 4x term over here to the left. How do I do that? I take it away because 4x minus 4x is 0. So that'll be gone. And if I do that on the right side, I also need to do that on the left side. And I'm going to put it underneath 7x because that's a like term. So 7x minus 4x is 3x. Bring down the minus 16 bring down the equal sign. I cross this off because that equals 0, so I don't need to write that. And then I still have a positive 2. Now I don't need to write that plus because the plus just tells me that it's positive. So now that I move my variables to the left side, I need to move my constants to the right. So this negative 16, I need to move over here because remember our goal is to get this x by itself. So how do I move a negative 16? I do the opposite operation or inverse. So I'm going to add 16 because negative 16 plus 16 is 0. And then I'm also going to add that on the right side. So I'm going to bring down the 3x. Bring down the equal sign, and 2 plus 16 is 18. And then remember the last step here. If you don't see an operation between the number and the variable, remember it's multiplication. And how do we undo multiplication? The inverse to multiplication is division. So we're going to divide both sides by what it is we want to get rid of. If we want the x by itself, that means we need to get rid of the 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1x equals, and I'm going to divide this side by 3. And 18 divided by 3 is 6. So I'm going to go back to the problem and see, is that what it's asking me for? Yes, it says find the value of x. So x equals 6. Okay, on to our next question. Number 9. If h is the midpoint, our vocabulary word, our highlight for the week, the skill. So h is the midpoint. It's given information. Because they tell you this is the midpoint, automatically you know that both of these sides are equal to each other. So this left side gh is congruent to hi. So those are congruent. So let's just finish this. It says h is the midpoint of gi, line gi. Find GH. So here is what it's asking for. So we need to remember that at the end, we need to know what GH equals. So we're not finding, we need to solve for x, but then we'll have to do a little bit of work. So it's another step to this problem after what we did in problem 8. So let's just start with what we know. We know h is the midpoint, so we know that 5x plus 2 has to be equal to 9x minus 10. Because we know those line segments are equal. Draw your line down the middle if that helps, and then we're going to get to solving. So how do I get the variable by itself? I get it to one side, so I'm going to actually move this 9x to the left side by taking it away, subtracting it, because 9x minus 9x is 0. I'm going to take it away on this side as well. So now I move that to the left side, 5x minus 9. So 5 minus 9 is negative 4x. Bring down the plus 2 because I didn't do anything with that. Bring down the equal sign and then bring down the 10, but I also have to bring down this negative because when we have negative numbers, you do have to write the negative. All right, now we want to move this constant plus 2 to the right side. How do we move it to the right? We use inverse operations. So if I subtract it, 2 minus 2 is 0. And I'm also take it away on the right side. So hopefully you're writing these steps down on paper as I go through this. And you can pause the video at any time if I'm going too fast. You'll want to ask yourself why I did what I did if you're stuck, or go back and rewatch it. Okay, so now we have our negative 4x is left, and on the right side, negative 10 minus 2. Don't forget this negative, and in the calculator, you're going to put that negative 10 and then minus 2. You should get negative 12. And then last step, usually almost always, and how to undo a number that's being multiplied by the variable, you're going to use division as the inverse, and we want to divide by the negative 4. A lot of times students forget to divide this negative in front. If you don't divide by the negative, you won't get rid of the negative. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is a positive 1x. Bring down the equal sign, and then divide negative 4 on the right side as well. So I'm just going to continue my line here. Negative 12 divided by negative 4 is positive 3. Now we're not quite done because we have to go back and read the directions, and it says find GH. We solve for x, which is the first step. But in order to find GH, well, let's look at GH. GH, remember, is our green line. So GH is, I'm going to write this in green. GH is 5x x plus 2. And now that we know this, what I'm going to write gh equals 5x plus 2. And now that we know what x is, remember we can plug that in and substitute that in for x. And then add 2. So 5 times 3 is 15, plus 2 is 17. So now we actually found the length of GH like the question asked. Okay, here's some more practice. Remember, the more practice you do, the better you'll get at it. You might want to pause the video here and draw this problem on paper. Write down the letters that represent the points, the expressions, and even the directions if it's helpful. So number 10, if R is the midpoint of QS. So we have our R, midpoint, them telling me that. I already know the things that we've talked about in each problem. I already know that this QR, 2x plus 16, equals this side, 5x minus 17, and the rest of the direction says find QS, which I see now they want me to find the whole length, QS, right? So we'll come back to that. Let's go ahead and do what we need to do first, which is solve for x before we can really find out anything else. So let's solve just like we've been doing for the last problems. You might want to pause the video here and ask yourself, what do you think, or even try to solve the problem before I do it. See if you can kind of apply what you've learned in the last two problems. So the first step, I'm going to get my variables on the left side. I'm going to take away 5x from both sides. 5x minus 5x is 0. 2 minus 5 is actually negative 3x. Bring down the positive 16. Don't forget that plus with it. That comes down as well. And then bring down this negative 17. And then I know that I need to get my constants on the right side or by themselves away from the variable. So I'm going to do the inverse of addition, which is subtraction. And I know that 16 minus 16 is 0. That's why I did that, because I want to move it to the right side. I want to get rid of it. Bring down the negative 3x. Again, don't forget that negative that's with it, the equal sign. And then negative 17 minus 16 is negative 33. And then divide by negative 3 on both sides. So x equals 11. If you did that before I did it, great job. If not, that's okay. Make sure you're writing these down. You can go back and watch the video again. So the question says I need to find QS. So I need to find the whole length. So there's a couple different things you could do here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite QR. I know that QR equals 2x plus 16. And I know that RS is 5x minus 17. Those are the two expressions for both of these segments at the top. So this is one segment, and then RS is the other. So if I find both of them, then at the end I can just add them together and I'll get my total. So let me just go back to my color I have here. So I know that x is 11, so I'm going to plug 11 or substitute 11 in for x in both of my expressions in order to solve those. So 2 times 11 plus 16 is 22 plus 16, which is 38. And then I know that 5 times 11, remember I'm substituting that 11 in. 5 times 11 is 55 minus 17. And I get 30. Let's do this on paper. If you can hear Artemis snoring, I apologize. My dog is snoring. I'm like, do I need to wake you up right now? Okay, so the right expression equals 38. And again, if we just add them together, you know that each side equals 38 because remember, they should equal the same. So that's 76 for the total line segment, which the question asked to find QS, which is the whole thing. So we just added 38, which was this side, and 38, which was this side, and added them together. Okay, last one here. Way to stay in there till the end of the video. You might want to pause it again to write this down. And like I said, please forgive Artemis for snoring so loud. So we're going to finish this up. So 11, if G is the midpoint of FH, so we see that G is the midpoint again. What I do notice about this problem is that it doesn't give me an expression, but that's okay because I know what midpoint means. I know that midpoint means the middle, and that whatever this left side is represented or whatever this equals, I know that it has to be congruent or the same as the right side. So I guess the rest of the problem says if FH equals 22, so if the whole line segment equals 22, solve for X. So remember, if the whole thing is 22, that's our total. So the total length of the line segment is 22. I do have 4x plus 3. And well, since they're congruent, why not just write that this side is also 4x plus 3? Because they're the same. So 4x plus 3, and I'm going to add 4x plus 3 again, because I'm going to add the red line and the green line to give me a total of 22. So now I have an equation I can solve for x, and I'm going to draw my line. So before I move things around now, like kind of what we done, I remember steps in the last video that said after distributive property, what I could look for is to combine like terms. So I'm going to see before I start moving things around if I can combine like terms. Well, I do see 4x plus another 4x, and I know that 4x plus 4x is 8x. And then I also see that this has a plus 3 and another positive 3, and 3 plus 3 is 6, a positive 6. So I'm going to go ahead and write plus 6, bring down the equal sign, and bring down the 22. Now this is a two-step equation. We don't have any variables on this right side, which is great. So now I can just move this positive 6 over by using the inverse operation, which is subtraction. 6 minus 6 is 0, so I move that. And I bring down my 8x equals 22 minus 6 is 16. And divide by 8 on both sides, so x equals 2. And just to check to make sure that's what it wants, the direction asked for, it asked me to find x, which I did, so x equals 2 is my final answer. So before you move on to the practice, go ahead and watch this video again if you need to, or a couple times, that's okay. Pause it, take notes, write down the work, try to do it before I do it, and then make sure you jump onto office hours this week on Thursday at 12 o'clock if you need any help. And I hope you have a great week. And let me know if you need any help or have any questions.